dust and desperation. In Miles City, the wind cut like a blade through the streets of Miles City that morning, swirling dust into the hem of Delaney Ellsworth's worn skirt as she walked steady beneath the pale Montana sky. She clutched a folded wedding dress against her chest, not in a box, not wrapped in paper, but carried like a fragile memory she couldn't afford to keep. Her son Rylan, no more than 4 and far too thin, kept close to her side. His little fingers tangled in the fabric of her skirt like he was afraid she might blow away if he let go. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes quiet in that way. Children's eyes shouldn't be too used to watching hunger pace the corners of every room. Delaney hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her stomach had gone beyond pain and into a dull hum of absence. Ryland had nibbled on bread traded for a comb and the last of her wild honey. That morning she'd stitched a loose hem on the ivory dress, her fingers cold and clumsy, threading it one last time like a goodbye. The dress was the only beautiful thing she had left, a relic from a time when love seemed like something that could fill a house. 5 years ago she'd worn it believing forever was a promise, but forever had coughed blood into snow and died 2 winters ago, and all that remained was this walk, this boy, and the knowledge that survival never asked for permission to be cruel. They stepped into the general store just as the sun lifted above the rooftops, casting hard shadows across the wood-planked floor. The bell jingled overhead like a memory of better days, and Delaney moved straight to the counter, not wasting breath. Her fingers trembled, not from nerves, but from cold that spring sunlight couldn't chase. She laid the dress down, unfolding it with care. "I need to sell this," she said, her voice plain. "It's clean. Worn once." It felt like bartering away the last part of herself that had ever dared to dream. The price of a wedding dress. The storekeeper, stocky, red-nosed and unimpressed, squinted at the gown through spectacles smudged with flour. "Ain't much call for wedding dresses out here," he muttered, brushing a hand over the lace like it was just another piece of cloth, not a vessel of years and hopes and vows. Delaney stood still, her jaw clenched, her spine straight. She wasn't there for sentiment. She was there for food. "Please," she said, swallowing the ache. "I need something for my boy." The man sighed like she was trouble he didn't ask for. He crouched behind the counter and emerged with a pouch of coins and a dusty tin of beans. $2 and this. Best I can do. Delaney didn't argue. Pride was a luxury people like her couldn't afford. She nodded, once tucked the money and the beans into her satchel, and reached down to lift Ryland into her arms. He was too light. Every time she held him, it scared her a little more. Outside, the sunlight had grown harsh. It didn't warm, it exposed. She stepped onto the stoop and blinked against the glare, adjusting Ryland on her hip. She didn't cry. She didn't falter. Just breathed once slow before a voice called out from behind her. "You got someone?" She turned fast, instinctively shifting Ryland behind her. The man who spoke stood a few feet away, tall, lean with dust on his boots and a tan hat pulled low. One hand held the reins of a chestnut gelding, the other a small sack of oats. His voice hadn't been sharp or unkind, just curious. Delaney squared her shoulders. "No," she answered. "I do not. A stranger named Isaiah." The man stepped forward slowly like he knew not to crowd a woman who'd seen too much. "Name's Isaiah Boon," he said. "Got a place west of here, 10 miles out. Cattle, mostly. Some horses. It ain't fancy, but there's food. Work, too, if you're looking." He spoke without urgency, without expectation, like someone offering a door but not pushing you through it. Delaney studied him. Dust coated his boots and the folds of his coat, and his eyes were shaded unreadable, but there was no edge in his tone. Still, she bristled. "You saw me sell a wedding dress and figured that I'd follow a stranger into the hills." Her voice was dry-edged with fatigue more than anger. "No, ma'am," he said gently. "I saw a woman do what she had to feed her child. That's not something most folks would even try. Figured you might be the kind who doesn't give up easy. And I've got a place that could use someone like that." Delaney looked down at Ryland, who had turned his head to peer at Isaiah with wide, wondering eyes. She thought of the beans in her bag, the $2 that wouldn't last the week, the ache in her limbs that hadn't faded in months. What kind of work? Cooking mostly. Laundry care for the animals if you know how. You'd be safe, both of you. I give you my word. She hesitated, the weight of choice pressing like a yoke across her shoulders. But there was something steady in Isaiah's offer, not pity, not pressure. Just room. She nodded slow. He led them to his horse and helped her mount up behind the saddle. Ryland nestled into her lap as they rode west, the land wide and open beneath the setting sun. The ride was quiet, but something in the air shifted as if hope, small and stubborn, had decided to follow them. A ride toward shelter. The road west stretched out like an old scar across the land, silent, dry and knowing. Delaney sat stiff behind the saddle, one hand wrapped tight around Ryland, the other gripping the edge of the saddle horn. Her legs ached from the strain of riding unused to the motion. Isaiah rode with quiet focus, neither too fast nor too slow, guiding the gelding with a practiced ease that made her think this was a man who didn't rush, who listened to the pace of things. The land shifted gradually from town dust to golden open plain. Sagebrush and rabbit grass waved under the breeze, and distant ridges sat under a wide sky bruised with sunset. Ryland's small fingers clutched her shawl, his breath slowing until he dozed against her chest. Delaney didn't allow herself to relax, but some of her rigidness softened just enough to feel the warmth from Isaiah's back, the smell of horse and sweat and leather like something solid. They passed no other travelers, no houses, no wagons, just the hum of wind and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. Delaney watched the horizon like it might disappear, half expecting the whole thing be a mirage. Another man with promises and no follow-through. But the land didn't lie, and neither did the calluses on Isaiah's hands when he dismounted and helped her down. By the time the cabin came into view, the sun had slipped behind the hills, casting long purple shadows across the yard. The house was modest, 2 rooms, wood smoke curling from a chimney, a lean-to barn in back, but it stood straight, every board set like it belonged. Isaiah opened the door and stepped aside. "You and the boy can take the cot. The stove's lit. There's stew warming." Delaney entered, slow scanning every corner. The place smelled of iron pans, dry wood, and something she hadn't felt in a long time, safety. Ryland stirred in her arms. She kissed the crown of his head and whispered, "We're stopping for a while," though she wasn't sure who she was saying it to. First fire. First rest. The stew smelled of lentils, carrots, and some kind of salted meat. Delaney ladled a small portion into a tin bowl and fed Ryland, first watching as the boy ate like it might vanish if he looked away. She didn't touch her portion until he was full. When she finally sat beside the stove and took a bite, it burned her mouth, but she didn't complain. It was the kind of heat that reminded her she was still alive. Isaiah busied himself near the hearth, checking the logs, stirring the coals. His movements were unhurried, as if he understood the value of letting silence do its work. When Delaney met his eyes across the room, he nodded once, like an agreement had already been made. Not with words, with presence. After Ryland had curled beneath a blanket on the cot, already slipping into sleep, Delaney stood at the door, cracked it open, and stepped onto the porch. The night air was cool, but not biting. Stars blinked between high branches. Isaiah sat on the porch rail, hat in his lap, eyes cast upward. "You meant it?" she asked, her voice low. He didn't look at her right away, just nodded. "I don't say things I don't mean." Delaney studied him in the dim light. "I'm not looking for anything more than a place where we're safe." "I'm not asking for anything more," he said gently. "But if someday you ever wanted more, you'd know where I am." She didn't answer, just turned and went back inside, lay on the cot beside Ryland and stared at the ceiling for a long time. It had been years since anyone offered her something without cost, and even longer since she wanted to believe it might last. Work without complaint, kindness without demand. By the week's end, the rhythm of the place had begun to settle in her bones. Delaney rose with the sun, scrubbed the floors until they shone, fixed the broken hinge on the chicken coop, and cooked simple meals twice a day. She didn't talk much. She didn't smile. But she showed up for the work and never once asked for anything more than what she'd already been given. Isaiah, for his part, never pressed her. He moved through the days with a quiet steadiness that reminded her of old cottonwoods, weathered but deeply rooted. Ryland took to him fast, trailing after Isaiah's in the mornings as he fed the horses, carried water, and checked the fencing. The boy didn't speak much either, but his eyes were brighter, his steps quicker. One afternoon, Isaiah found Ryland fast asleep in the hayloft, curled beside a burlap sack of oats. He carried the boy down carefully, arms cradling the child as if he were made of glass, and laid him beside Delaney on the cot. She looked up, met Isaiah's eyes, and said softly, "You're good with him?" "I like kids," he answered, wiping hay from his sleeves. "Always figured I might have some. Just never met the right woman." Delaney looked down at her hands stained from scrubbing. "My husband died 3 winters ago," she said. "He was kind, but we had nothing. After he passed, people stopped helping." Isaiah's voice came quite low. "That's a hard thing." "I don't have much to offer," she said after a pause. "Just my hands. Already gave away the only nice thing I owned." Isaiah looked at her, then not like a man evaluating what she was worth, but like someone seeing what she'd survived. "You gave away a dress to feed your child," he said. "That's not nothing." And for the first time in a long while, Delaney believed it might be true, a shared confession. The days unfolded like pages from a book Delaney hadn't expected to keep reading. The air turned warmer, the frost lifting from the edges of the field with each morning sun. Ryland's cheeks began to fill out, touched with color again, and the silence in the cabin became less of a shield and more of a space to breathe. Still, Delaney didn't speak much unless necessary, and Isaiah respected that unspoken boundary as though it had been drawn with chalk. But that evening, after supper, something shifted. Ryland had fallen asleep with his head in her lap, a quilt draped over him like a second skin. The fire in the stove crackled low. Isaiah sat across the room, whittling a thin branch into something not yet clear. His knife moved slow and steady. The quiet stretched until Delaney spoke. "My mother died before I turned 12, she said softly. Fever took her fast. My father tried to keep the farm going, but grief doesn't plow fields. He followed her before the year ended." Isaiah didn't interrupt, just set his knife down and gave her the stillness of his attention. "I married young," she continued. "Too young, maybe, but there wasn't much else. He was kind. We didn't have much, but we had something, until his lungs gave out that winter." Isaiah nodded, the lines at the corners of his mouth deepening. "That's a hard road." She looked up, eyes sharper than before. "I've had to sell near everything. My rings, my books, that dress." She glanced toward the corner where her satchel sat. "I don't tell you this looking for pity. I just want you to know I didn't come here with anything." "You brought your boy," Isaiah said. "You brought your hands, and you brought yourself. That's more than most." Delaney didn't respond at first, but in the glow of the lamp, something in her face shifted, less guarded, more seen. "I never thought I'd tell all that to a stranger." Isaiah smiled gently. "Maybe I'm not one anymore." A bolt of cotton. The next morning, the cabin was filled with a faint scent of dew and last night's wood smoke. As Ryland helped Isaiah with feed buckets outside, Delaney took down the bolt of soft white cotton Isaiah had given her days before. It was still untouched, still folded perfectly along its factory creases. For a long while, she just ran her fingers across the fabric, memorizing its weight. She hadn't sewn anything for herself in years. Everything she'd made recently was out of necessity. Patched knees, reinforced seams, hems let out for Ryland's ever-growing limbs. But this fabric, this gift, it wasn't for trade, wasn't for mourning. It was offered without condition. That night, while Isaiah repaired a section of fence beneath moonlight and Ryland slept in the loft with the barn cat curled beside him, Delaney laid the cotton across the cot. She lit the oil lamp low and began measuring, cutting slow and precise. She didn't rush. She wasn't making this because she needed to. She was making it because for the first time in a long while, she wanted something for herself. Outside, the wind pressed against the window like a quiet visitor. And inside, beneath that pale glow, Delaney pieced together the beginning of something new. A bodice that might catch the light, just right sleeves that could hold warmth, a hem wide enough to dance, if she ever remembered how. She didn't know what she'd wear it for, but that no longer seemed like the important question. Blossoms of routine. Spring came fully, and with it, the gentle rhythm of a life worth keeping. Delaney tended to the hens in the early hours, pruned the young squash vines by noon, and scrubbed shirts by the new wash tub Isaiah had rigged for her sun-warmed water from a black barrel, a ring of firestones to heat it longer when needed. She no longer ended the day with the dull ache in her lower back, and when she thanked him for the setup, he only tipped his hat and said, "Seemed fair." Ryland, meanwhile, flourished. He laughed more, now ran barefoot in the yard, with a wooden spoon pretending it was a sword, and carried wild dandelions to his mother like they were precious metal. Isaiah taught him how to hold a brush, how to speak low around skittish horses, and how to feed the gelding one flat palm at a time. Sometimes Delaney would catch Ryland talking to the mare like it was an old friend, and she'd press a hand to her heart to steady it. One evening, after the sun dipped below the ridge, and the wind picked up just enough to shake the cottonwood, Delaney and Isaiah sat side by side on the porch. Ryland was asleep inside, The air smelled faintly of sage, and the silence between them was tender. "I've something for you," Isaiah said, reaching into his coat. He handed her a small parcel wrapped in muslin. She opened it slowly. Inside was a strip of clean white cotton, the same kind he'd given her before. "I thought maybe you'd want something nice again," he said. "Not silk, not lace, but new. Yours." Delaney blinked hard. Her voice caught. "Why would you do this?" Isaiah looked at her with quiet certainty. "Because I want to give you more than a place to sleep. I want to give you a life, if you'll have it." Delaney didn't answer right away. But she didn't need to. The way her fingers clutched the cloth, the way her eyes stayed locked on his, it said enough. The carved horse and chamomile pillow. As spring stretched across the plains and the last patches of snow disappeared into the soil, the world around the cabin softened. The fields began to green and the trees near the creek unfurled new leaves like timid hands. With that change came another, quieter, harder to name. Ryland began waking in the night. He didn't scream, he didn't thrash, but his little body would tense and he'd make these low, wordless cries, sounds that made Delaney sit bolt upright in the dark, her arms already reaching for him. She'd rock him back to sleep without asking questions because she knew some fears are too deep for names. She had them too. One morning, after such a night, Delaney found a carved wooden horse sitting beside Ryland's cot. It was simple, sanded smooth along the edges, with tiny painted eyes, and a tail made of tied thread. Ryland lit up when he saw it. He ran his fingers over its sides like it was a treasure pulled from legend. Delaney didn't have to ask who had made it. That same afternoon, while hanging a sheet to dry on the line, she caught Isaiah glancing up at the cabin window, his hands stained with sap and sawdust. She didn't say anything then. Instead, she harvested chamomile blooming by the fence line and laid the flowers out in the sun. When they had dried enough, she stitched them into a muslin pouch and tucked it into Ryland's pillow. That night, he slept deeper longer, the kind of sleep she hadn't seen him fall into in months. They were small gestures, a carved toy, a scent meant to soothe, but in Delaney's heart, they were everything. Cornbread and a choice. 2 days later, Isaiah returned from Blake's homestead with a sack of cornmeal slung over his shoulder and a new scrape on his cheekbone. He brushed it off like it didn't matter, but Delaney noticed the way he favored his ribs when he bent. That evening she used the last of the cornmeal to make cornbread thick golden, slightly uneven but warm. When he walked up from the pasture at dusk, sweat darkening his collar, she met him with a tin plate. "Figured we could share this," she said, "since I hauled it all the way here." Isaiah accepted the plate with a surprised smile. "Much obliged." They ate side by side on the porch, the twilight stretching around them. Chickens clucked softly in the yard. Ryland was inside napping with the carved horse tucked beneath his chin. Isaiah spoke first. "Got word from town. Harris Ranch lost 3 cattle to wolves. They're hiring riders to patrol the perimeter. Just for a week or 2. Delaney turned slightly toward him. "You thinking of going?" I told them no. He shrugged. "Plenty here needs tending." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You could have gone. You don't owe us anything." Isaiah didn't speak immediately. He chewed another bite, slow and thoughtful. Then gently, "It's not about owing. I don't want to be where you and Ryland aren't." Delaney turned her face just enough so he couldn't see the way her throat tightened. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman a man waited for. Isaiah leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees. I'm not waiting, he said. I'm living with you. Here. It's just better. The Sunday dress. The next morning, Delaney rose early, dressed Ryland, and made a quiet breakfast. She didn't speak much, but there was a firmness in the way she moved, a quiet decision in every gesture. As the sun rose, casting linen-colored light across the fields, she stepped outside in the dress she had sewn with her own hands. It was simple, clean white cotton, fitted at the waist, with a blue ribbon she had found at the bottom of her old sewing tin. Her hair was braided neatly down her back. No ornament, no powder. Just her. Just real. Ryland waited barefoot beneath the cottonwood, holding a bouquet of chamomile and purple thistle he'd gathered himself. When Isaiah saw Delaney step into the light, he didn't smile. Wide. He didn't say anything loud. He just stood straighter, like something inside him had settled. I don't have a preacher, he said quietly. Don't have a paper. But I've got you, and I've got what's in my chest. Delaney's voice was steady. I don't need a piece of paper. Just your word. You already have it, he said, for every morning that comes after this one. She reached for his hand. Then that's enough. Ryland stepped forward, held out the bouquet. Isaiah knelt, took the flowers, then pulled the boy into a quiet embrace. Is it okay if I call you P now? Ryland asked, voice small but hopeful. Isaiah nodded, voice thick. It's more than okay. That night they sat together on the porch as the stars came out one by one, the wind slow through the grass, the scent of sage and warm soil filling the air. Delaney leaned into Isaiah, her dress soft against his side. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again, she whispered. You are, he murmured, and you always will be. Not because I said so, because I'll make it so. And for the first time in years, Delaney believed it. Spring turns to summer. By midsummer, the land had fully awakened. The garden behind the cabin burst into life. Rows of green beans climbing twine squash leaves the size of saddles, fanning out beneath the morning sun. Delaney moved through it all, with sleeves rolled and hair tied back, her apron smudged with earth and satisfaction. Each time her hands sank into the soil, it felt less like toil and more like belonging. Isaiah had added a drawer to the kitchen table. It was nothing fancy, just a smooth pine box that slid in tight beneath the wood. But it held her last few spools of thread, a small tin of buttons, and a folded piece of cloth she was hemming into a shirt for Ryland. The boy had begun to outgrow the sleeves of the shirts Isaiah had given him. He never complained. But Delaney noticed. One afternoon, as golden light stretched long across the pasture, Isaiah returned from the ridge road with a canvas bundle tied behind his saddle. His face was sun-darkened, his collar damp with sweat, but his eyes had a kind of quiet spark that made Delaney's breath catch as he dismounted. You were gone longer than I expected, she said, brushing her palms on her apron. I stopped by the ledger office in town, he replied, untying the bundle with care. Thought it was time we had this. He handed her the wrapped parcel. She unfolded it slowly, and inside was a framed deed, her name written beside his in ink, straight as a fence post. I wanted you on it, Isaiah said. Not for show, because this is yours too. Delaney stared at the paper thumb pressed gently to its edge. I never asked for this. No, he said, but it's still yours. She carried the frame into the cabin and set it beside the hearth. It didn't feel heavy. It felt solid, like something that couldn't be taken. Like roots. Unexpected visitors. The wagon arrived just after the midday meal wheels creaking under the weight of supplies and the long ribbon of dust trailing behind. Ryland spotted it first from the ridge near the corral where he'd been helping Isaiah mend a broken fence. He came barreling down the hill, cheeks red with excitement. "There's 4 girls in the back," he shouted breathlessly. "And one's got a bonnet with little blue flowers." Delaney wiped her hands on her skirt and stepped onto the porch just as the wagon turned into the yard. Isaiah emerged from the pasture a moment later, leading the roan by its reins. His cousin Matthew climbed down first, taller than Isaiah, but with the same quiet jaw, same dust-worn boots. His wife followed. Then the girls tumbled out like seeds from a burst pod, each clutching some small treasure from home. A doll, a wooden spoon, a folded shawl. Introductions came swift but warm. The women helped Delaney draw water-spread blankets and settle the younger girls in the loft. Matthew and Isaiah spoke in low tones near the barn, checking hooves and harnesses, the way men do when old bonds are being reknit by new time. At supper, Delaney brought out the last of the cured pork and fried potatoes on a wide enamel tray. They ate on quilts beneath the cottonwood fireflies blinking in the grass. One of the girls, no older than Ryland, turned to Delaney and asked with wide blinking eyes, "Is he your little brother?" Delaney paused. Then she said simply, "Here's my boy." Isaiah looked over at her, not with surprise but with something steadier, deeper, like he had always known that answer was coming and had already made peace with it long ago. When the wagon leaves. That night, the girls slept curled like kittens beneath quilts in the loft. Matthew and his wife took the porch bench, whispering soft about the road ahead. Isaiah wandered to the edge of the garden where Delaney stood, arms folded, watching stars blink through scattered clouds. "They'll leave in the morning," he said, stopping just beside her. Delaney nodded. "They seem like good people." "They are." "Matthew had a hard spell after the war," Isaiah murmured. "Took a long time for him to come back to himself." She turned toward him. "And did you?" He didn't answer right away. "Just looked up at the stars?" "Took me longer," he said at last. "I didn't know what I was waiting for until you stepped into that store." Delaney reached out, touched his arm above the elbow. "I never told you what I was running from." "Not really." "You didn't have to," Isaiah said softly. "I saw it." "I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of starting over, of needing something again, something that could be taken." She looked toward the cabin, its window flickering with warm lamplight. "Now I have a life I built with my own hands, and someone who saw me before I had anything to offer." Isaiah took her hand. "You gave me more than I ever thought to have." They walked back together in silence, the kind that felt like a thread tying 2 lives into one. Inside, Ryland slept with one hand tucked under his chin. Isaiah bent and lifted him gently, carrying him to the hearth pallet like he weighed nothing. Delaney watched from the doorway. Her arms were folded, but her heart finally was open. A Sunday shirt for Ryland. The morning after the wagon rolled out, Delaney stood at the window watching dust rise behind the retreating cart. It didn't sting like it used to. This time it felt like parting, gentle, inevitable, and without loss. Ryland stood beside Isaiah in the yard, one small hand curled around 2 of Isaiah's fingers. The boy watched the disappearing wagon, then leaned against the man who had become a kind of quiet anchor in both their lives. That afternoon, Delaney unpacked the last of the dried apples and folded cloth from the kitchen shelf. There was just enough of the white cotton left, the same bolt Isaiah had gifted her months ago. She smoothed the fabric on the table, fingers lingering along its surface, and felt something she hadn't named before: ownership. Not just of cloth or thread or food, but of time, of choices, of care. That night, as Ryland napped, curled beside the barn cat in the loft, she mentioned it to Isaiah while handing him a tin plate of cornbread. "I thought about something," she said. "That cotton, what's left of it, I think I'd like to make Ryland a shirt." Isaiah looked up, brushing sawdust from his hands. "He'd like that. He's never had anything made just for him," she added. Isaiah's voice softened. "I reckon he's not the only one who's never had that before." Delaney turned her face into the dim firelight, hiding the curve of her smile. Peace comes slowly. There was a shift in the wind the next morning, no longer sharp with the bite of late spring, but warm, carrying the faint scent of river mud and sweetgrass. Delaney opened the cabin windows, letting the breeze move through. The dress she had worn on Sunday hung neatly behind the door, but it was Ryland's shirt she was stitching now. Tiny buttonholes, a rounded collar sleeves just long enough for his growing arms. Isaiah returned from the field at noon, shirt clinging to his shoulders, dirt under his fingernails. "I got the paddock gate fixed," he said. "Had to brace it with an extra beam." Delaney poured water into a tin basin and handed him a cloth. "You think about things like that before anyone asks." Isaiah shrugged. "I think about what makes your days easier." She didn't answer, but her eyes stayed on him longer than usual. That evening she scrubbed shirts in the new tub behind the barn, her back no longer aching as it had in the early days. When she thanked Isaiah again for building it, he only tipped his hat and said, "Seemed fair." Later, they sat under the cottonwood near the chicken yard, mugs of chicory coffee in hand. The wind threaded through the branches, and somewhere nearby a frog sang low in the dusk. Isaiah sipped and stared toward the horizon. "I had a sister," he said, 4 years younger. She didn't make it through the diphtheria in '76. Delaney's breath caught. "I'm sorry." "She was quick," he continued. "Could mend saddle blankets faster than I could ruin them. I think about her sometimes when I see how Ryland follows you around. That kind of gentleness." Delaney traced the rim of her mug. "I had no siblings. My mother died before I turned 12. My father not long after. I married because there wasn't much else." Isaiah didn't fill the silence. He let it stretch warm and companionable. "I started cutting the pieces," she said eventually. He turned to her. "For the shirt," she nodded. "I want to wear something I made again. Not because I need to, but because I want to." Isaiah's smile was quiet. "Then I'll build you a sewing frame. So you've got space to work." Delaney's lips curved slightly. "You're always doing things for people who don't ask." His voice dropped. "Only when I want them to stay." That night she ran her palm across the folded cotton laid out on the cot. Ryland stirred in his sleep, murmuring something about horses, and Delaney tucked the quilt tighter around him. There was no more fear in the quiet, only something that felt like beginning, the life they built. Summer deepened. The garden spread wild and generous. Isaiah strung new lines for the beans and built a small scarecrow from old clothes Ryland picked out himself. Each morning, the three of them worked their own rhythm. Delaney tending the herbs and vegetables, Isaiah riding fence or repairing tack. Ryland chasing the hens or lying flat in the grass, counting clouds. The cabin changed slowly but surely. Isaiah added a second drawer to the kitchen table. Delaney hemmed napkins from flour sack cloth. Ryland began reading aloud in the evening, stumbling through simple words with his finger pressed to the page. Sometimes Isaiah would quietly carve while Delaney sewed, the only sound, the ticking of the stove and Ryland's voice, shaping stories. They didn't call it a family. They didn't have to. The proof was in the rhythm, in the unspoken ease. In the way Isaiah brought Delaney a pail of chamomile before she asked. In the way she brushed dirt from his shoulders when he returned from the pasture. In the way Ryland, half asleep at dusk, always reached for Isaiah's hand before drifting off. It was peace, not the sudden, triumphant kind, but the slow kind. The kind that creeps in like sunlight through curtains unnoticed until it warms everything. One evening after Ryland had gone to sleep with a wooden horse tucked under his chin, Delaney stood at the window watching Isaiah check the paddock gate. He moved like someone who had come to know the land in his bones. When he came back in, she was waiting with something to say. "There's a strip of that cotton left," she said. Isaiah leaned against the door frame, eyes warm. "Enough for something small." She nodded. "A shirt. For Ryland. I think he'd like it. I think he'd love it," he said, then stepped closer, brushing a hand across her cheek. "And I reckon he's not the only one who's never had something made just for them." Delaney leaned into his touch, steady as breath. "I didn't know it could be like this," she whispered. "Quiet. Good. Like there's room to breathe." Isaiah kissed her brow, slow and sure. "There's room for everything here," he said. "You just had to find it. A visit from the past." The wagon came in just after the midday meal, its canvas top bobbing in rhythm with the uneven road creaking under the weight of supplies and time. Dust trailed behind, like a memory curling in the air long after the wheels rolled past. Ryland spotted it first from the ridge where he'd been helping Isaiah check the last of the fence posts. He tore down the hill, barefoot, breathless, and flushed. "There's 4 girls in the back," he called, "eyes wide. And one's got a bonnet with little blue flowers." Delaney stepped out onto the porch, drying her hands on her skirt. The wagon turned into the yard, just as Isaiah crested the hill behind it, leading the roan at a steady pace. He raised one hand in a short wave as the wagon came to a stop. His cousin Matthew climbed down first, taller than Isaiah, but with the same lean frame and watchful eyes. His wife followed, and then the girls tumbled out like laughter, each clutching a piece of home. A worn doll, a tin cup, a scarf, smelling faintly of lavender. Introductions were simple. The women immediately set to helping Delaney draw water and spread blankets, while Matthew joined Isaiah by the barn to check the wagon team. Their voices were low but easy, 2 men reconnecting through the familiar motions of work. That evening, they gathered under the cottonwood for supper, fried potatoes, the last of the salt pork, and hard biscuits softened with honey. Fireflies blinked across the grass, and the youngest girls curled into each other on the quilt long before the stars appeared. One of them, a girl with gap teeth and curious eyes, asked Delaney, "Is Ryland your little brother?" Delaney didn't pause. "He's my boy," she said, voice calm and sure. She felt Isaiah glance her way, not in surprise, but in quiet agreement, like he'd always known that answer and had only been waiting for her to claim it aloud. The meaning of staying. After the children were asleep and the lanterns dimmed, Matthew and his wife took the porch bench. Isaiah stepped out into the fading light and found Delaney standing at the edge of the garden, arms folded, eyes turned to the stars just beginning to appear. "They'll head out early," he said. She nodded. "Your cousin seems steady." "He is. He had a rough go of it after the war," Isaiah said. "It took him time to find his footing again." Delaney tilted her head slightly. "And did you?" Isaiah gave a soft chuckle, low, almost ashamed. "Took me longer than it should have. I didn't know what I was holding out for. Not until that morning in the store. You standing there holding that dress like it was the last piece of your name." Delaney's voice came quiet. "I never told you what I was running from." "You didn't need to," Isaiah said, his tone steady. "I was afraid," she admitted. Afraid of starting again, afraid of needing anything that could be taken away. She looked toward the cabin where a flickering light warmed the curtains. "But now I've got something I built with my own hands, a child who's safe, a man who saw me before I had anything left to give." Isaiah didn't speak. He just stepped beside her and took her hand. "You gave me more than I ever thought I'd have." They walked back together under a sky stitched with stars. Inside, Ryland lay sprawled across his cot wooden horse tucked beneath his chin. Isaiah knelt beside him, lifting the boy into his arms with a tenderness that felt deeper than words. Delaney watched them, her arms folded across her chest, but her heart wide open. The picnic on the bluff. The next day the wagon pulled out after sunrise, leaving behind nothing but wagon ruts and laughter lingering in the dust. Ryland waved until the girls were gone from sight. His small hand clenched tightly around Isaiah's. That afternoon, Delaney packed a basket, bread, dried apples, a jar of beans, and they rode together out to the bluff that overlooked the wide rolling prairie. Ryland sat nestled between them on the wagon bench, his shoulders pressed against Isaiah's side. The wind carried the scent of wild grass and distant pine. Above them a hawk circled its cry, cutting clean across the sky. They spread a blanket beneath the twisted old cottonwood and sat for a while in comfortable silence. Ryland traced patterns into the dirt with a stick. Isaiah unpacked the bread. Delaney passed around the beans. Then Isaiah reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "I stopped by the notary again," he said, voice low. "Figured it was time we set things down proper." Delaney unfolded it slowly. Her name was there beside his again, but this time beneath the word marriage. Dated. Signed. She traced the ink with one finger, silent. "I know we already live like it," Isaiah said, "but I wanted to give you a name that matched the life." She folded the paper carefully, then tucked it back into the basket. "There's not a part of this I'd change," she said. That night they lay beneath the quilt Delaney had pieced together from scraps of old shirts and feed sacks. Ryland slept nearby, hand curled under his cheek, the carved horse still tucked beside him. The cabin smelled of cooling bread and sage. Isaiah reached across and brushed a stray hair from Delaney's cheek. "You're not afraid anymore," he whispered. "No," she said, steady. "I'm not." Years passed, and the house grew. The years didn't rush. They rolled slow and steady like the river that curved just east of the property, always there, sometimes hidden beneath the snow or grass, but never gone. By the second spring, Isaiah had added 2 more rooms to the cabin, one for Ryland with a loft bed and a little desk built from leftover planks, and one small porch facing east to catch the softest light of morning. The chickens multiplied, The garden expanded, and the cottonwood stretched taller with each passing season. Delaney planted chamomile every spring, always in the same corner by the fence, letting it take root like a quiet ritual. Rylan learned to ride on the roan Isaiah had trained just for him. He read books Isaiah brought back from town, built rabbit traps that rarely caught anything, and carved his initials into the barn door with the same pocket knife Isaiah had once carried on the cattle trails. Neighbors who once kept their distance now waved as they passed, bringing eggs to trade or news from the county. They didn't call them the Ellsworth woman and the Boon rancher anymore. They were simply the Boon family, not out of formality, but because no one could remember them as anything else. And in the quiet hours when the sun dipped behind the hills and the chickens settled in the roost, Delaney would sit on the porch steps, Isaiah beside her, their hands intertwined like it had always been that way. 1,000 quiet acts of love. Peace didn't arrive with trumpets or sudden epiphanies. It came in small, unspoken moments, a cup of coffee left warming by the stove, a blanket pulled higher in the middle of the night boots, set by the door to dry. Isaiah never stopped carving. Ryland's shelf slowly filled with small animals, tiny horses, and eventually a full wooden town, complete with a stable and general store. Delaney's sewing grew finer shirts for Ryland, curtains for the windows, and mended sleeves that fit Isaiah just right. One spring, when Delaney came down with a fever that settled hard in her chest, Isaiah kept the house warmer than usual, changing damp cloths on her forehead every few hours. He didn't leave her side. Not once. Ryland fetched wood and soup, sitting silently by her bed with the carved horse in his lap. She recovered slowly, and when she finally stepped back outside, the world had turned green again. The chickens clucked a little louder, the bean vines reached a little higher. Isaiah handed her a fresh mug of chicory coffee and said simply, "You scared the hell out of me." She only nodded and reached for his hand. That was how they lived, without fanfare, but full of meaning. What was built? On a summer evening, thick with the scent of cut grass and sun-warmed earth, Delaney watched Ryland walk ahead of them, now a tall boy arms, swinging freely a scrap of blue ribbon tied to his belt loop like a talisman from a time he barely remembered. They walked slowly behind him, her hand tucked into Isaiah's, the fields gold with late light. "I never thought I'd live a life this quiet," Delaney said. Isaiah smiled, lines deepening around his mouth. "It's not quiet to me." She looked at him, brows raised. He shrugged. "It's full. You'll just have to listen for it." Back at the cabin, she placed a fresh loaf of bread on the hearth to cool. The garden glowed in the last of the sun. A breeze stirred the curtains. Ryland sat at the table, reading aloud from a book about rivers and stars. Delaney stepped outside as the light faded, standing still for a moment beneath the cottonwood that had witnessed it all. Her fear, her faith, her slow becoming. Isaiah joined her, sliding one arm around her waist. She leaned into him, cheek resting against his shoulder. Peace, she had learned, didn't always come from escape or victory. Sometimes it came from staying, from planting roots, from being seen, not for what you had lost, but for who you chose to become afterward. And she had become someone who was loved quietly, wholly, and without question.